All right. Thank you all for being here this morning. Good morning. My name is Stephanie Seidman. I'm with Undaunted K-12. It is an honor to welcome legislators and staff to this briefing on extreme heat's impacts on children at school and how we can protect students. We have got a great lineup of speakers today, so let's jump in. So starting with some housekeeping. This is a Zoom webinar, so please use the Q&A feature and we will answer questions at the end. The webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides will be shared with all participants and registrants after. So we are here today to talk about hot classrooms, uncomfortable classrooms, classrooms where it's harder to concentrate, classrooms where it's harder to learn, classrooms where kids are more likely to get in fights, where teachers are more likely to be tired, where children with pre-existing health conditions are more likely to experience an asthma attack or a panic attack or an ER visit. And these are just some of the ways that students and schools are impacted by extreme heat as new research sheds light on these impacts. We also know that these impacts are felt disproportionately and that they are exacerbating gaps in educational equity that our state and local leaders are fighting so hard to close. Schools in low wealth areas, small and rural school districts, and schools serving more Black, Latino, and disabled students are least likely to have functioning air conditioning and more likely to sit in hotter neighborhoods. Research shows that as much as 5% of the gap in test scores between Black and Latino students and their white counterparts can be directly attributed to exposure to excessively hot classrooms. Meanwhile, 20% of California schools have no AC, and many more have broken or inadequate HVAC systems. Again, these burdens are disproportionately borne by under-resourced small school districts that are least likely to be able to access state and local funding for modernization. Underscoring all of this is that children spend more of their waking hours at school than any place else. So when we talk about hot classrooms, we're not just talking about the classrooms themselves where students learn and play, but the rooms in which children spend the majority of their day. And in California, many of our school buildings were constructed decades ago before the epidemic of extreme heat that we're seeing today. National data show that nearly 40% of US public school buildings were built before 1970. Our schools simply were just not designed for the sustained high heat that we're seeing today and that we will see even more pronounced in the years to come. And I want to just pause for a moment and talk about the image on the screen. This is a photo that I took at Leadership Public Schools, a high school in Richmond where I used to teach. In 2015, we got a new beautiful school building that you can see in this photo. Not only is it beautiful, but it is LEED certified. It's got solar panels. It's got energy and water efficiency measures. It is a school that students and staff were proud to walk into every day. But unfortunately, with all of the thought that was put into bringing this beautiful building into existence, no one looked at the local heat projections and prioritized putting in AC. Richmond has historically not been an area that needed cooling in schools. It's a city in the Bay Area. But I can tell you that in the fall of 2019, when wildfires were raging during a heat wave, and we had to keep all of the windows closed and we had no respite from the heat or the smoke, it was a miserable and scary and immensely stressful few days of school when we even had school, because one of those days school was closed completely because of this issue. In the near future, more than 1 in 3 California students are going to experience high heat days for close to a third of the year. So that bears repeating. There will be at least 120 days each year above 87 degrees, with dramatic implications for student health and learning if we do not ensure modern HVAC and cooling in schools. Yet in California today, we have no statewide indoor temperature standards for classrooms. We don't require cooling in K-12 schools, and 2.6 million students attend school with less than 5% tree canopy for shade on schoolyards and playgrounds outside. And so we know this is not news to many of you because we've worked with many of you on these issues over the past few years. We've held briefings like the one we're holding now. We've shared policy proposals. Many of you have been champions of meaningful bills that have come across your desks helping to address these problems. And for that, we express our immense gratitude. And we've seen real progress from the legislature in other sectors. So worker safety regulations, now require protection starting at 82 degrees. Housing standards are moving towards maximum indoor temperature requirements. Student athletics now have heat illness protocols and wet bulb temperature limits for play. Even correctional facilities are being required to plan for and prevent dangerous indoor heat. But the places where children spend more of their waking hours, their classrooms, have not received the same level of attention and protection. Schools remain a policy gap in an otherwise growing statewide approach to extreme heat, even while children with their smaller bodies are more vulnerable to heat impacts. So that is why today matters. We are here to share new research, real stories from the classroom, and practical opportunities for legislators to help children stay healthy and be able to learn. In a moment, you will hear from our speakers about the latest statewide data on heat, learning, and health and recommended approaches. And we will also hear from a student at Truckee High School about his lived experience going to school in a changing climate. And we will share recommendations that are actionable, that are mindful of our financial outlook and budget deficit, and that support you to support the schools in your legislative districts and across the state. We know this issue is urgent. We know that funding is limited. We really want to be your partners as you think about ways to support your districts and our state to protect children and their education from extreme heat in schools. So thank you so much for being here today. And we are going to get started with the research. So I am going to turn it over to our partner, Lana Zimmerman at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, who's going to share their new research findings.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Lana Zimmerman. I work with the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, and our mission is to advance effective and equitable solutions to pressing environmental challenges through actionable research that engages UCLA scholars, policymakers, and communities. Next slide, please. So I'll be talking about why it's important to have cool schools, and we'll be looking at this from the lens of indoor and outdoor heat exposure and how that affects the students in these schools. Next slide. So for some students, schools may be the only place where they can cool off. As Stephanie mentioned, many hours of their day are spent in the classroom and at times outside on the playground. And in January of 2025, this year, my team and I worked on a statewide poll facilitated by the Luskin School to focus on issues of concern to Californians. Our survey sample was around 2,400 California adults, and my team focused on air conditioning access in homes and schools. Our findings showed that 2% of caregivers reported children having no AC access at home or at school. This percentage of respondents was highest in California Climate Zone 5, which is a coastal and typically cooler climate zone in California. And in Climate Zone 5, 10% of caregivers reported that their children have no access to AC at home or school. And this can potentially be a life-threatening situation for these children. Next slide. Cooling in homes and schools protects children's health, learning, and development. So we focus on the exposure setting framework for looking at heat exposure for children, and homes and schools are children's primary settings throughout the day. These are areas where children really need to be adequately cool to properly develop, learn, and thrive. So cooling either setting helps create an environment where they can thrive, but really the solution is to cool homes and schools. Next slide, please. So looking at outdoor heat exposure, I'll start with why hot schoolyards are dangerous. Next slide. Hot schoolyards ultimately threaten children's safety as well as the safety of faculty and staff on these campuses. On hot, sunny days can create burns on the skin, whether that's a burn from radiant heat exposure from the sun or touching school equipment on the play equipment on the grounds where children are playing, or even I've heard some teachers say they're standing on blacktop and they can feel the heat almost melting their shoes. And so we found that in this graphic, we modeled air temperature at 92 degrees Fahrenheit. And the air temperature is significantly different than the surface temperature that children, faculty, and staff at schools are experiencing. On a rubber mat, the temperatures can get up to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide, please. So how can we cool schoolyards? Shade is our best solution. Blocking the sun really helps reduce the heat burden, particularly from radiant heat. It cools the surfaces and the people standing under the shade. So we have this graphic here that shows really the difference that you can make from cooling even on the grass. It goes from 139 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun to 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Next slide, please. So next, I want to talk about why hot classrooms are dangerous. Next slide. So when a school year gets hotter, students ultimately learn less. And as Stephanie mentioned, this particularly applies to students of color. Our studies show that without air conditioning, for every degree hotter the school year gets, test scores go down by 1%. Next slide, please. So how cool is cool enough for classrooms? Ultimately, we need more research on this. As Stephanie mentioned, there's been indoor heat standards being set for residential areas. Ultimately, there's no threshold for schools or homes for what a cool enough classroom or home is. But here we know that California childcare facilities need to be between 68 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'd also like to point out that New Zealand recommends classroom temperatures around 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's quite a bit of variability, but ultimately we know that access to indoor cooling really helps children to learn and thrive in the classroom. Next slide, please. So how can we cool classrooms? There's a variety of methods. Passive cooling by shading buildings is one way to do it. Building retrofits can also help, but ultimately in very hot environments, cooling equipment, particularly active cooling equipment, so that would include HVAC systems or heat pumps, are really needed to get classrooms to safe temperatures. Next slide, please. So now we'll take a look at heat in California schools. Next slide. These findings are all from the Luskin, California poll that I mentioned was conducted in January 2025. We found that despite the poll being sent out after the wildfires that were affecting the state, heat was still a #2 priority issue after, I think the first issue was fires. So our findings showed that half of California's caretakers have kept kids home from school due to heat. And this statistic really varies by climate zone. So we used the CEC California climate zones as a way to break up our findings and look at how they vary across the state because California really isn't a climate monolith. And in this graphic, you can see that inland areas are prone to hotter days throughout the school year. And in these inland regions, caretakers are more likely to keep their children home from school. Interestingly, we found that inland areas tend to have more AC access at home than coastal regions. This could be because they experience typically hotter days. But yes, ultimately, kids are being kept home in high numbers in these regions. Next slide, please. So our study showed that most children have access to air conditioning in at least one room at school. 73% of caregivers reported having access to AC in at least one room. So that could be the main classroom. It could be in other indoor learning facilities on campus. 6% of respondents reported having no access to AC at school. And again, I want to reiterate the statistic that 2% of caregivers statewide reported that their children have no access to AC at home or school. And we are particularly concerned about that population because these children have nowhere to cool off. So that concludes my research, and I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Lana. And I'm just going to be building on a little bit of what Lana was sharing. So, a lot of what we've been talking about today already is actually the best case scenario. On a hot day when school doesn't have adequate HVAC, the best case scenario is that school children and their learning suffer in hot classrooms. The worst case scenario is actually that the school closes for the day or sends kids home early or is otherwise disrupted, and students miss out on critical learning time and whole communities are disrupted. So at Undaunted K-12, we've spent the last few years tracking how extreme weather disruptions like extreme heat are impacting students' education and learning time. And there are some key findings we've discovered as we've engaged in this work. So, first of all, students are very tangibly losing out on learning time and school time because of extreme heat and weather events. Schools are shutting down across California, not only due to the heat, also due to wildfires, flooding and storms, power outages, and public safety shutoffs, which often coincide with extreme heat events. And these school shutdowns or early dismissals or simply disrupted days compound. Over a school year, even modest closures can accumulate into substantial setbacks affecting student opportunities, graduation readiness, test scores, and long-term outcomes. Last year, 13% of California students were impacted by a school disruption or closure due to extreme weather, cumulatively losing out on 8.8 million instructional hours. And for extreme heat specifically, California students lost 54,000 instructional hours last year, impacting nearly 25,000 students at 35 schools. This school year, more than 15,000 students have lost a cumulative of more than 55,000 instructional hours due to weather-related closures and disruptions, and more than 70% of closures and disruptions have been caused by extreme heat events. So this year, extreme heat events are really kind of very pronounced in this data. And these closures are putting undue financial burden on already stressed school districts. So every closure comes with costs. Lost funding tied to attendance, potential need for makeup days or summer instruction, lost productivity, increased pressure on staff, and over time, these costs undermine district budgets. And these closures also hurt parents and communities when parents have to stay home from work because the school's HVAC system broke on a hot day. And that erodes trust in our government and school systems among families when schools are open intermittently and can't keep kids safe on now routinely hot days. So ultimately, we are not getting the full investment our state makes in education because we are learning in substandard conditions. Students are losing out on learning time, and we are spending more and more each year on emergency response when we should be investing in adaptation and resilience. And on that point, I just want to kind of double click that it is so important that we invest in adaptation and resilience. Last year, the US Chamber of Commerce released a study that showed that for every $1 spent on climate resilience and preparedness, communities save $13 in damages, cleanup costs, and economic impact, of which many of these kind of educational impacts are kind of calculated in that economic impact. So thank you so much, and I am going to turn it over to Andrea Goyen.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. And just real quick, introduce myself. I'm Andrea Goyen. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at 10 Strands. And building off of what Stephanie was just saying, like that investment has never been more important. So one of the projects that we worked on at 10 Strands is looking at climate impacts data and showing those projections over time in the next 3 decades. And really thinking about how are our school communities going to be impacted by it. So we took a number of different statewide databases for climate impacts and national databases and brought that down to the educational audience and really thinking through which school districts are most vulnerable to that and which counties. And so I'm sharing a slice of that data here, which is the high heat data, and really trying to understand this. So if you look at the table graph, what it's showing is that currently most counties counties are already experiencing about 30 days of heat above 87 degrees. And there are a handful of counties, about 16 counties, that are experiencing that for months, right? So for over 120 days of having that many high heat days. And as the decades progress, so as we move towards 2035 and then 2045, you'll see an increase in the amount of counties that are really projected to have high heat days. So making that investment now is really critical in order to because basically this problem's not going anywhere. It's only going to get worse, right? So that's what the data shows. And so we're here to say, let's invest now to protect the children of today and the children of tomorrow. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'll just share here that there's a couple different tools that I just wanted to uplift. The California Department of Public Health has a great heat risk grid to help us kind of wrap our heads around what does that really mean to have that level of high heat and some of the health impacts of it. And then there's a heat risk dashboard that you can really drill down by zip code if you want as well. And then go to the next slide. And then last kind of data project that I wanted to share here in this research portion is to understand what this means for tree canopy and shade. So our partners at Green Schoolyards America, they did an incredible data analysis of looking at tree canopy on school grounds. And first of all, I would just say the foundational thing to note is that there's not enough trees planted at schools. So that's already the issue. And then what's showing here in the graph is that the trees that are planted at schools, most of them are in a zone that's not really accessible to students. So they're actually planted on the exterior or protecting the cars in the parking lot and not the kids on the playground. So what this project is about is really showing that vulnerability and saying let's start planting trees. Let's get our tree canopy up to about 30% on the schoolyard so that kids have access to shade and that they're not having to cancel recess, which we've seen in many schools in the last couple of years, or cancel PE or cancel after school sports, but instead getting kids access to that natural shade so that they can go to that. So that's just a couple of different data projects that we wanted to highlight as part of this research segment. And then go ahead and go to the next slide. And then we invited a student here today to give some real world testimony. So if you go to the next slide, I'll introduce Kai. I met Kai through our California Youth Climate Policy Leadership Program, and I'm so grateful to Kai for his leadership. He is a senior in the Tahoe-Truckee region, so he's at the Tahoe-Truckee Unified School District. And Tahoe is a really prime example of places that have not necessarily historically needed AC, but as these impacts of climate change become more real, and this climate shifting has intensified, it's a region that's really getting hit by extreme heat. So I'm going to invite Kai to share a little bit about his experience and his peers' experience in the classroom.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kai Krenicki. I'm a senior at Truckee High School in Lake Tahoe, and I'm a part of California Youth Climate Policy. I worked in the political sphere in my hometown, participated in Model United Nations, and I'm on the student council for my school. My building has a lot of new portions of it, recently built, but 2 years ago, after a very extreme event of weather, the roof of our school nearly caved in, and it disrupted our school's academic environment to a massive degree. It forced students to change their class schedules, it forced teachers into substitute classrooms, and cut off necessary parts of the school like the library and the counseling office. On the other end of the spectrum, Truckee has had the hottest summer on record, and this record is broken almost every single year as the average temperature keeps increasing. Existing in the mountains where temperatures are typically manageable means we have no air conditioning in a vast majority of our buildings. Countering this, the heat during the summer no longer remains at average levels, often surpassing 100 degrees. It is hard to live in weather like this that should not exist in the Sierra Nevadas. Coupled with the fact that we do not have the infrastructure to defend against this high level of heat means that coping with this environment while pushing yourself academically is incredibly difficult. When students are working to be their best in their academic sphere, making them balance survival in a harsh environment while juggling all of their extracurriculars and everything else they have in their lives is an incredibly difficult task to bear. As you are all well aware, fire also poses a huge danger to our local community. The massive amounts of smoke have inhibited our ability to not only go to school, but also work and perform necessary tasks. These fire dangers also endanger our lives. By barring off the once decaying portion of our campus and being proactive to ensure the student body isn't at school while potentially dangerous events like heavy smoke or blizzards are occurring, our district and on-site executives have previously tried to protect us from such weather as best they can. Though they are doing their best, true replacements to infrastructure, like providing funding to install HVAC in places that need it, focusing on real preventative measures against the looming fire threat, replacing our archaic and low functioning electrical grid, along with updating its energy sources, and being cautious as the signs of extreme weather show. Currently, our town has absolutely no snow, which is an incredibly abnormal event considering the date, and spells disaster for California's water economy. If the signs of these issues are left to fester, the problems will only worsen until they come to a head. Thank you so much.
All right, Kai, thank you so much for being here with us. It's really meaningful to have student voice and testimony. Before we jump into policy recommendations, I just want to start with a quick plug for some context, additional context and recommendations coming out of a brief that we collaborated on with state agency CCEE, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, early last year. So if you haven't seen this short report and its recommendations for state leaders, do take a look. And I am going to turn it back over to Lana with some policy recommendations coming out of their report.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. So I will get into some of the things and actions that the state can take to cool schools and also homes, because we know that homes and schools are exposure settings that really feed into each other, and students and children spend most of their time there. Next slide. So our newest report for our HEAT team at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation is titled Keeping Children Safe by Cooling Homes and Schools in California. And this report focuses on optional actions the state can take to promote the installation and maintenance of cooling systems, including air conditioning and heat pumps in California homes and schools. So I'll be doing a quick sort of run through of our findings and some of the new data we included in the report. The good news is there's a broad base of support in California for policy action around cooling children's spaces. For homes, nearly 80% of Californians say that the state should prioritize AC access. And then for schools, it goes up to 92% of Californians that support state action on AC access in schools. Next slide. So to give a primer on how we arrived at these recommendations, I started by taking a broad look at heat bills across the country. It came out to be around 330 plus heat bills, and we filtered those by the ones that pertain to indoor environments, particularly homes and schools. We identified several legislators in Oregon, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Washington who were real leaders on this issue to talk to them about what was working for their heat bills and what were some of the challenges that they were having in getting these passed. I took their advice, workshopped it, and applied it to our California context. And then from there, I took a rough set of recommendations to California agency and legislative staff and talked to them about what they thought could work, what are issues that are pressing of importance to the state. And that's how we got to the set of recommendations that we have. So the inputs included policy research, interviews, and then this database of heat bills, which is all accessible via the link that was sent in the chat. Next slide. So what can the state do to help with the installation and maintenance of cooling systems? Our first recommendation is to update indoor cooling standards. And because there are no statewide upper thresholds in homes or schools, these standards can be set in a few different ways. You can model them around children's needs. You can model them around exposure settings. So whether it's a residential place that children or people are exposed to heat, whether it's in a school, as Cal OSHA did in a place of work as well. You can also set the standards by climate zone. So we heard from Kai talking about living in a traditionally cooler climate and how they're ultimately unprepared in a way that maybe hotter regions have more infrastructure to be ready for heat events. And our second recommendation is to make indoor cooling access and disparities transparent with better data. There really is a need for data collection because currently there's no count of schools with or without indoor cooling systems. There's some counts that the CEC does for residential buildings, but without a count or a look at where cooling systems are or where they need maintenance, it's difficult to make updates in areas that are of particular need. Our third recommendation is to formalize interagency collaboration on heat management in these indoor spaces, particularly homes and schools. Currently, homes and schools at the state level fall under different agency jurisdictions and what they have the power to do. But it really crosses a variety of agencies, and establishing a place where they can collaborate and share information could help drive this issue. Next slide. So our fourth recommendation is to refine communications and messaging about cooling systems. There have been mis and disinformation campaigns around heat pumps, and ultimately not a super centralized resource for people, legislators, agency staff to go to get this information. So just putting it all in one place could be helpful and making it public for people. Our fifth recommendation is really one of the most important ones, which is making funding available for indoor mechanical cooling. This could include making temporary programs long-standing, but ultimately having these resources for schools to access and homeowners or renters to access to make sure that they can be in cool spaces. And then our sixth recommendation really applies to every category, and it's prioritizing equity. And this can take a variety of forms. So Prop 2, the schools bond that recently passed, expanded state shares of costs and hardship cases. However, the way the school facilities program is set up can prioritize wealthier districts that are able to raise more money per student. So this can be bridged with more technical support, taking a look at that program setup and application assistance for schools. So I'm happy to be a resource going forward if anyone has questions. Again, all this information is explained in detail in the report that was linked in the chat. And now I'd like to pass it to Leah to continue this conversation.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm Leah Stokes. I'm an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara, where I work on climate and clean energy policy. And I'm also part of the 2035 initiative, which is an on-campus think tank that works on a variety of climate issues, including cleaning up our schools. And for quite a while now, many years, I've been partnering with Undaunted K-12 to find support for electrifying California schools. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the main program that we have in our state called CalShape and some of its successes and its current status. So if you're not familiar with CalShape, it's a program that was created in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, by the California legislature, and it lives at the California Energy Commission, the CEC. CalShape stands for the California Schools Healthy Air, Plumbing, and Efficiency Program. But what it actually is a program to help electrify our schools. So what it did initially was it helped schools, over 5,000 of them across the state. Keep in mind that we have north of 10,000 in our state, sort of assess what is the state of their heating and cooling and plumbing systems. And a lot of that funding for that phase one work of assessing the state and doing some basic maintenance of our systems, a lot of that money went to disadvantaged communities. And it did things like installing carbon dioxide monitors, doing some basic air filtration upgrades, and getting a sense of where do we really need to make big progress in terms of electrifying our schools? Because as we know, heat pumps can both heat and cool the schools. And as we heard today, including from the student testimony, we really have to get on top of cooling our schools for learning outcomes, for healthy, safe environments for our students. So this phase two of the work is about upgrading and repairing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But the short story is that CEC abruptly froze that funding last summer on July 1st, 2024. And we continue to work as a coalition to unfreeze that funding so that schools can continue to make progress, because only 156 schools out of 10,000 in our state have received those funds that actually help them, for example, get a heat pump HVAC system. So it's really just a drop in the bucket, and we've got to make more progress on this. But I do want to give you some of the good news here, some of the successes. So on the next slide, on the next two slides, we're going to talk through some examples of schools that did get those phase 2 funds and that are working towards electrification. Santa Barbara Unified, which is, my school district, it received both that phase 1 grant to figure out the system, and then it received a phase 2 grant of $6 million to upgrade and electrify. And the other really amazing thing about Santa Barbara Unified, in part because of the leadership of then school board member Laura Capps, who is now our county supervisor, is that they created a position of an energy manager for the unified district. And this person has been going around, getting heat pump water heaters and, figuring out how to save energy and do efficiency upgrades and help electrify. And I think that is a model that really can pay for itself at school districts if that's something that can be replicated more broadly statewide. The other example that I just wanted to lift up today is Irvine Unified on the next slide, which received nearly $5 million for that maintenance and assessment work, and then for the upgrade work of the ventilation system, and another $1 million for plumbing. So although today we're focused a lot on the HVAC part of the upgrade and repair phase 2 grants, getting heat pumps into these schools, there is also, of course, plumbing funding in this program as well. So a lot of these funds, as you'll see on the next slide, are really going into disadvantaged communities. So of this $446 million, 45% of the total program budget went to projects at schools in underserved communities. And, that is above some of the targets that are out there. And so it's really exciting that this is a program that is helping kids all across our state, no matter what their economic background is, have a healthier learning environment. And that's why I'm so supportive of this program and want to see it continue, because I think it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to be doing. On the next slide, I just want to point out that, again, in 2022, we together, including with Undaunted K-12, worked to get $20 million from the GGRF funds. What does this mean? So there's, of course, a cap and trade program in California, and every year when those rights to pollute, for lack of a better term, get auctioned off, they create revenue for the state, right? And it can be upwards of $4 billion a year. And we worked to get $20 million from that program to help schools put heat pumps in their schools. That funding helped 19 schools undertake these HVAC replacements, which they had identified when they went through those phase 1, planning grants, essentially. And again, that funding really went to priority populations, way above the statutory 35% requirement, and even exceeding other sorts of targets in terms of making sure that everybody gets to come along in the clean energy transition. But as you can imagine, 19 schools again is only a small fraction of the investment we need. And so right now there's ongoing negotiations to think about where those cap and trade GGRF dollars should go. And we believe that some of that funding should go to the CalShape program to continue to, really create equity in our learning environments across the state. And on the next slide, which is my last slide, I believe, I just want to highlight again that the CalShape program was abruptly paused. We could get into all the weeds about this, but essentially all these schools, and just imagine you're a school, right? You've gone through this effort to understand the system using those phase 1 grants, do a planning thing, okay, here's the state of my HVAC, here's what I need to do. And the CEC opens up those awards to help you actually change those systems out and electrify your school, which also gives you air conditioning. And think about the resources at the school district level to go and do a grant like this. It takes a lot of time and effort to go through all the hoops that the state puts forward. And Many schools were working on this and they decided to change the deadline to apply within just a few days. Imagine if you were applying for university as a senior in high school, and suddenly the deadline for the applications to university went from October 1st to September 15th on September 13th. That's essentially what happened to the schools. It really wasn't fair, right? Because all these schools are working really hard to try to do the right thing by their students, to do the right thing by the communities and our climate. And so we need to give them a fair shot to actually make these changes. There's so much left to do through the CalShape program. And so far, only 172 schools have been able to actually make those repairs and upgrades to their HVAC system. So when we've got those 10,000 schools, 5,000 of which have done assessments, and only 172 have made those upgrades, you can see that this really is a place where we need to keep making progress. So I'm really excited to be partnering with all these groups to continue to support the CalShape program, because I think it is exactly the kind of thing that we need to see going forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Andra.
Well, yes, thank you, Leah, so much for taking us through that and for really getting into the weeds of like, what does this look like? How does this play out? I think that was really helpful to hear. And I'm going to just do a little bit of conclusion with a few last policy recommendations here. And I'll say, I see the challenge of addressing high heat in our state when I look at this little graphic that's here of just how big our state is and how complex it is with so many different ecosystems. This is hard. And it's, we're talking about this topic in December, and right now I'm like freezing in my house. I'm like in this bundled up thing, and we're talking about high heat. But I know just a few weeks ago on Thanksgiving in LA, right, it was well over 80 degrees. So it's like we're all experiencing this temperature thing differently across our state. But what we should take away from this is that all of us are dealing with heat at some point, right? And taking care of heat is an important part of being resilient. HVAC systems are not just for heat, they're also for other issues like dealing with pandemics, right? So all of this builds into this idea of resilience. And so one of our recommendations is about having resilience coordinators and building out a county network of resilience coordinators that can support school districts across the state. Now, this concept really came out of my own experience of being the first environmental literacy and sustainability coordinator to serve in a county office of education. And I served from 2017 to 2022. Now there are 7 other county offices that have a role like that. But what those folks, when they were hired, we were not hired to be sustainable facilities and resilience coordinators. It was really more environmental literacy coordinators, right? But folks in those roles have now found themselves in this position of trying to take in climate data and make these like suggestions for, hey, I know we're dealing with floods and I know we're dealing with heat, and here's maybe some of the facilities upgrades you should do. But a lot of the folks that are in those positions are really more from a curriculum background. And so what we're putting here out as a recommendation is that we need some resilience coordinators who can work across jurisdictions, who can work with county governments and other elected officials, who can work with municipal governments, who can work with other agencies to really have that technical expertise of like, how do we handle this in our facilities and operations? So our recommendation is to have resilience coordinators at the regional level who can support at the county and then district level to bridge those connections between school districts and those jurisdictions. And we're hoping that legislators will work with their other elected officials, their county Office of Education superintendents, or even the folks that are appointed to those positions, and start to say, like, how can we help you work together to solve these issues of climate impacts? Because when our schools shut down, it shuts down everything. We all know that because we all experienced COVID and the shutdown that happened and what it means when kids can't go to school. So the idea of these regional resilience coordinators is to help kids get back to school where they should be and to do it in safe and sustainable and climate resilient school grounds. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Couple other recommendations that we have is to think about what kind of policy could be in place for heat safety education. We know that we need our students and we need our staff to be able to recognize when somebody might be struggling with heat illness. We're going to put in the chat box a student who is actually elevating this issue in Sacramento Unified School District. A middle school student through her Girl Scout troop decided to elevate this cause and say, like, I would like to get some education so I know what to do if a peer peer of mine on the playground starts to experience high heat illness, and what can I do with that? So that's one thing that could be done at a policy level. Another thing could be to really, I know you've heard us say this multiple times today, but we just need more data. So supporting at the county level and at the school district level to do that data collection and to work to do multi-jurisdictional local hazard planning with school districts. Too often, school districts are really left out of that conversation, even though they're in the territory of our cities and in the territory of our counties and in the territory of our legislative districts. They're often left out of the conversation, and it's time to bring schools directly in and to have them have a seat at the table as we do things like extreme heat action plans for a county or a municipal area. And then the last thing here is just to think about like how can we as partners, legislative partners and school districts, how can we work together to really understand bond measures and think about the successes and failures in passing local bonds and how these dollars could be used for HVAC systems or for tree planting or shade structures. So those are just a couple of handful of other types of policy recommendations, but really more like partnership recommendations that could be done with school districts. So I think that's it for me. I think we're going to turn it back over to Kai to give a few more closing words.
Thank you so much for all of these experts giving us such great information. And I want you all to take all the information they've given you into consideration to help protect the millions of children in our schools and defend their right and ability to thrive and learn. The climate will not wait for you to act. Every year you delay action, another group of students' health and learning are impacted by these increasing extreme heat and weather events. Thank you again for attending this briefing. Understanding how to support students and schools in your districts who are experiencing these impacts like I am is critical to the future of the education system, our health, and opportunities for California students.
All right. Thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists. Thank you, Kai, for closing us out. We are going to move into the Q&A section of this briefing. So if I can ask the other panelists to come on video, and then we can take your questions two ways. You can either type them into the Q&A feature, and it looks like a few of you have already done that, or you can raise your virtual hand and we can unmute you, and we can do it that way.
Great. And Stephanie, I can start with addressing Esther's question, then I'll invite other folks to maybe address this as well. So the question is, what are the challenges that districts and disadvantaged communities face for applying for these grants? And I would say like probably the biggest challenge our school districts face is just not having the capacity to apply for these grants. You know, the vast majority of California school districts are actually very small and don't necessarily have large teams of folks who can answer who can apply for these grants. And so technical assistance is definitely needed. That's part of why we want to have those resilience coordinators is that school districts time and time again say, we just need support. We just need help to figure out how to navigate these grant requests and find those dollars. So I think technical assistance is really critical. And then just, of course, unlocking the dollars again is the other really critical piece. But that's my thoughts, my 2 cents on that.
I also want to add, as HVAC systems become more technically complicated, technical expertise can also be a challenge going forward and something that we can anticipate in having proper maintenance people that know how to maintain these systems, things like that.
All right, and then we've got another question that we can answer live. Um, I was curious if this policy could possibly be extended to public universities in the state, especially with universities that have older buildings.
I'm
Is there a
happy to
panelist?
take that if this is
Thanks,
helpful.
Leah.
So I'm part of the UC-wide decarbonization committee. I don't remember exactly the name of our committee, but it's essentially that. And the state government actually gave us funds to do a sort of our own version of phase 1 of CalShape, so planning. And you can now look up the UC plans for how to decarbonize the 10 different campuses. UC Santa Barbara actually proposed a $300 million integrated HVAC system that would have a single place where the HVAC lives and then plumbing that runs throughout all the campus. And we showed that that costs far less than either putting one heat pump in every single building or replacing each gas boiler as it comes up. Both of those things are much more expensive. The thing is that there isn't specific funding yet to support those plans that the UCs have put forward. It's kind of like we got phase 1 grants and not phase 2 grants. And so there's ongoing work to find different funding sources to try to clean up the UC campuses. And I can't necessarily speak to the Cal State or the community college program, except to say that in Santa Barbara, I did work with community college to help secure a funding for a solar battery microgrid, which does create a kind of resilience center, which we've seen also at schools. Doesn't clean up the HVAC, but does help make the school more resilient. So there's lots of work happening at universities, and there is still need for more funding as well.
Thanks, Leah. And then we've got another question that I think might be good for Andra. Can you describe what data is currently available in order for local communities to understand their situation and what the state can do to improve that?
Yeah, sure. I can definitely talk about that. So there's some data that we have been able to collect at 10 Strands that is we were able to publicly scrape a bunch of different databases and data sets, and then also just like do a lot of Google searching as well to see what's going on out there. And what I would say is that we currently have a lot of data related to climate impact. So I already shared that about thinking about like how do we think about our climate impacts? On that same page that we had put in the chat box, and I can put it back in there too. On that same page, there's also a data project that was done in I don't want to say the wrong school, but I think it was UC Santa Barbara, who also had done some data scraping to understand what those impacts would be at individual school sites as well. So that data is also available. And then I would say what the other kind of data that we have collected through our data project is really just understanding what progress is being made at school districts towards environmental sustainability and environmental literacy. So it's a bit more broad than just understanding the climate impacts, but it might help people to think through like what is going on, what type of investments are being made in terms of like policy investments, or which of our school districts might have like an energy manager or a sustainability coordinator or things like that. And which of our school districts have started to make investments in energy like renewables or in resilience or in even things like dealing with like stormwater management. So the data that I just put into the chat box, the link there, shows a little bit of that progress. And we are doing more and more of this data collection to get deeper into some of these indicators to really understand. And so that combination of understanding like the vulnerabilities of climate impacts and also the beginning of investments being made at school districts should help local folks really think through like how ready is our school district to handle some of these threats. And we're just at the beginning of this. So right now what we've got is like some baseline data, and we're going to go much further on this data work. Because like we said a number of times in this, data is super, super critical to having like an equity informed approach to really identifying these gaps and starting to make those investments as is needed.
All right, and we've got a question that I think might be good for Lana. For the policy recommendation on better data on cooling systems, is there a vision of where this would be housed and how school districts would provide that information? If and how could this produce reforms for public schools' requests for facilities
Yeah.
funding?
Yeah, I mean, data collected from the school facilities program applications can help launch a broader effort for collecting facilities data for school. But ultimately, we need schools that are not applying for school facilities program funds to be counted as well. In terms of where the data is housed, is not something that we have explored comprehensively. So we're open to looking into that more. But our main focus is that while some of this cooling system data is being collected in applications, it's kind of a piecemeal stopgap approach to data collection. And we want something that's comprehensive and accessible, publicly accessible to all people. So maybe it's housed on an agency's website, or wherever researchers and people involved in school facilities work can access it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to that. We know um, there are other states who have this data, right? So this it's not like this isn't being done in other states. So I just wanted to say like it's absolutely critical that California invests in a statewide database for this work. Just to be super clear, Florida has done that. California can do that too then, right? So this is definitely something that we can do. We know other states are doing it, and it just needs to happen, and it needs to be housed in a place that everybody can have access to it.
And I just want to add that Undaunted K-12 has been advocating for this for years and has passed several bills through the California legislature to do this, and they need to be signed and, actually brought into the world so that we can have information.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, it's hard to make progress without information. And then another great question, I think, for Lana. In your research, have you found concerns around students walking or biking to school with high heat impacting their attendance? Is there any issues related to public transit and attending school?
Interestingly, so this was covered in another branch of research that we did. And at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, we have a countrywide state shade map for, I think we have 330 urban areas mapped. And in Austin, we did a look at shade coverage on routes to school that children are taking. So we mapped out every school in Austin, and we have a interactive tool where students can map their route to try to find the shadiest route. That's the extent to which we've looked at it. We didn't look at specifically public transit stops for students. We did another study in Detroit, using our shade data, where we looked at all public transit stops in Detroit to see whether they were sheltered or unsheltered, and then what the shade coverage at those stops looked like at different parts of the day when the sun's angles change. Um, so I'd say our work, let me go back to the question. Um, our work is primarily around shade cover and how that protects children from the heat on their routes to school, just because that tends to be the most accessible way to keep them thermally safe. I'll go ahead and drop that link in the chat.
And then maybe just if Kai, I don't know if you have any anecdotal evidence to share with any of your friends or peers about how kids are getting to school and how extreme heat might impact those routes.
Well, it would be pretty hard to walk or drive to school up here, but I will say that during the winters when we have really high snow, because like it's all building up, like we have a really hot summer and that makes us have a really huge winter. Um, it has been getting more and more extreme every single year with where we will get very, very little snow, and then we'll get hit by a massive blizzard and we'll have like a week off from school. Um, during the summer as well, our school parking lot actually is something I was just thinking about. You mentioned like wanting to do more shade in that area or just areas around the school. It gets very, very hot. I have had things melt on my car. I had weather stripping melt off before, just because of how hot the area gets. No, there's no shade. It's just a giant black asphalt square. So I will say that huge heat like that has made it incredibly hot and damaging to my car.
Thank you, Kai. All right, so we are at time, but I wanted to provide all of you with some of our contact information because we would love to partner to support both statewide action as well as action within your legislative district. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists, and thank you all for attending this webinar. And we will be sending the slides and the resources and the recording as soon as we have all of that together for you. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.